Welcome to the Quark and Roll podcast. I am your host, Kwok Hui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Septemmy Lakawa, who teaches mission studies, trauma theology, and feminist theology at Jakarta Theological Seminary in Indonesia. In this episode, we will talk about her work, about trauma-informed mission studies, as well as approved theology that she is developing, which talks about decolonial feminist theology. Septemmy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Professor Kwok Hui Lan. It is an honor and a blessing for me to be here, and I believe it will be a good conversation.
Septemmy, I have known you for a long time and always impressed by your work on trauma-informed reconciliation and healing. Can you share with the audience why you have developed such an interest?
It's a long story. My major is in mission studies, and I studied trauma theology afterwards. So it's like those are two separate fields. But then my fieldwork during my dissertation research while at Boston University School of Theology took me to a small island in eastern part of Indonesia, in North Halmahera, where I met about 20 local Christian women and those who, not only this group of women, but survivors of Muslim Christian communal violence at the turn of century. So listening to their stories made me realize that I could not talk and teach and reflect on mission studies then separately for trauma, and in this case, trauma theology and vice versa. So based on that really real encounter with this group of women and also local Christian community in the aftermath of religious communal violence, then I started to develop not only theological reflection, but really a deep sense of understanding that teaching mission cannot be like centuries ago. It has to be not only embedded and rooted in the experience of local people, but also to relook at the meaning and the experiences when the women whose stories that I have been able to witness to are those stories of trauma. So one of the things that really challenged me to rethink about one particular concept of witnessing, it is a huge concept within mission studies, testimony, witnessing, but also the concept of healing. So trauma studies, trauma theology, feminist theology then have helped me to understand much, I don't think it's much better, but much deeper of how to be in mission, how to engage, how to participate in God's mission, through which I come to understand and I come to realize if God is the one whose work is known through God's mission, and in this case, in my encounter with these women and Christian local community is through their stories of trauma, then what kind of healing, what kind of theology, what kind of mission that I as a Christian, Indonesian Christian woman could offer? It's not only as part of my theological reflection, but just as a way of living out my faith. So that's what, the real experience, real encounter with these survivors of religious communal violence in Indonesia between Muslim and Christians that really got me into rethinking. But even way before that, it was in my encounter with them in around 2004. But I think one of the most challenging and one of the huge shift in my understanding as a feminist theologian is in the aftermath of May 1998 in Jakarta, after the gang rape of Indonesian Chinese women. That's really changed my understanding of how to be theologian. In my case, a Christian feminist theologian, because it was the existential question that theology failed to help me to understand, even to respond. What kind of theology that I could speak of, that I could testify through in the face, within the stories of women whose body have been gang raped. And that's when I realized theology had failed, but it took me years to find an avenue, in this case, trauma theology, to find a language that could address when language falters in the face of the wounded body of the women who were raped, but also with this Christian community when religions were used to justify violence against one another.
Can you talk about why this animosity or hatred towards the Chinese leading to that gang rape?
In May 1998, especially in Jakarta, the capital city, witnessed the shift in the political power within the national leadership from the second president of Indonesia, Suharto, after ruled the country for 30 plus years. And then it was a military power that really, testify to the possibility even that a state could use its military power to fight against its own people. Why Chinese women? It's a long history, because the colonial history, there were a structure that defined Indonesia at the time. The first one would be the white people, the Dutch, and then the Chinese and the Pribumi. That's the indigenous. And the Chinese had been used as a tool to really divide Indonesian people, not only from their racial perspective, but from their own part in the economic system from within the colonial structure of power. So we never realized that, but we knew that being Chinese in Indonesia, especially during the 30 plus years of the second president, Suharto, was a way to position ourselves as an enemy toward each other. And I'm not Chinese, in a sense, from within that category. To be a Chinese is even equal during those periods with being part of the Communist Party. So the reason being why the rape was against Chinese people in Jakarta, it was one, political terror and military terror. Why the Chinese women? Because they are one of the most victimized, one of the most vulnerable groups within the structure of the Indonesian society. So it's not only that they are women, but also because they're Chinese. So those double minority, the status that even equal to those being victimized, and that the stigma is already there. So I remember in 1998 when the riot took place in Jakarta. Later on, then we realized that there were rape in some areas in Indonesia, in Jakarta, especially in the big city, in the capital city, against the Chinese women, but also violence against Chinese people in some areas in Jakarta as the capital city. I then realized I shared the existential feature, being women, but one thing that I do not have is me as a Chinese. So I am a minority, being a woman, being a Christian, but I do not share that racial identity as being Chinese. So I think because of that part of the history, it makes me aware that when I talk about who are the Indonesian women, I need to be aware of the different category that where Indonesian women have been put and categorized by the order of the second president of Indonesia at the time.
You talk about theology or the churches as failing to address the gang rape or violence against women. Why do you think theology failed? And what would be the kind of theology that is needed to address the situation?
In 1998 and post-1998, a lot of women, through the women's network, feminist network, including interfaith and Christian, already addressed the lack of even the common agreement that there was gang rape against the Chinese women, but also because of the persistence of the women's network in Indonesia at the time in 1998. Then the third president of Indonesia, Habibie, worked with the women's network, women's organization, then established the first time what we now know as the National Commission on Anti-Violence Against Women. So that's the beginning in 1998 as a response to the fact that there was gang rape against Indonesian Chinese women in May 1998 in Jakarta. From my point of view, theology at the time responded in a way and putting those experiences into the category of suffering. But then the lack of understanding that it's a different kind of suffering. Referring to Shelley Rambo, for example, trauma is suffering that remains. So I wasn't aware of that. I still use the feminist category of the suffering that women had to bear, the body that bears the wounds and so on and so forth. But the lack of understanding toward what theology should respond and how does theology respond to the reality that the suffering that the women's body bear because of the violence against their very body remain, that the remaining of these wounds, not only within the mind, but the entire body, how do we respond to that? And it challenged the Christian common understanding of suffering, that suffering will end. At the end of the day, God is good. At the end of the day, everything will be fine. How could I say that to survivors of such horrific violence committed by those in power? And even through last year, 20 plus years after 1998, the Minister of Culture of Indonesia still said the rape against the Chinese in May 1998 was rumor, gossip. So when I heard that, a lot of people starting to challenge that view, and I remember then made clear decision that it is my time again to really speak out loud and publicly. So I used the platform of me during the inauguration of my full professorship to really challenge that and then come up with the right academic speech on gossip as a different kind of theology. In a way, it's my response to this political statement that such a horrific violence never existed. And it's still there. It's like people starting to doubt. And for me, theology, because of me understanding now the importance of theology pointing toward the remaining of the wounds, then I believe that theology has only one option: to speak, to testify, to channel, and even to speak out loud and to challenge those people in power with all the riskiness.
I remember attending your inauguration of full professorship online, and it was a wonderful ceremony. And I recall that you are the first woman to become full professor in your seminary, Jakarta Theological Seminary, which is the oldest seminary in Indonesia. Now, you have also published a book, and it is called Compassion and Trauma, A New Imagination of Mission Studies. Can you share what the book is about?
The book is really part of the dissertation that I wrote for my doctoral degree at Boston University School of Theology, but it is different in a way that I wrote it also bringing the behind the scene, my encounter with the women that I shared earlier about their stories. So me bringing the idea of how to be compassionate, but from within the story of trauma. It's very risky encounter because to be compassionate while being traumatized. Nobody wants to be there, I believe. It is like asking those who have been traumatized to be compassionate. But then I think my way of putting this book to become an offer, it is a contribution, not only to the discourse. That's why I decided to write the book in Bahasa Indonesia, in Indonesian language, because it is a tribute to those women whom I encountered during my dissertation research. But also it is a tribute to those women who really have challenged and who have changed my understanding as a woman theologian, as a feminist theologian from Indonesia, that it all comes from heart. To be compassionate from these very particular experiences is to acknowledge the vulnerability of being compassionate in itself. Because the hearts that I was talking about is the hearts and the mind and the body who have been traumatized because of violence. And from within that woundedness, what I try to communicate is that there is something that persists even from within the woundedness. What persists for me is love. It's a different kind of love. It is a love not only knows what pain is, but it is a ruptured love. It is not a perfect love. It is ruptured love. But within that rupturedness, the perfection comes true. That's the idea. Within that book, can we expect survivors of trauma to love again? Yes, but it's a different kind of love. It is a ruptured love. Why rupturing? Because when something is ruptured, there is this in between, the lights come through. And for me, that's what hopes is. That's what the new imagination of mission. It comes true. It becomes sometimes dim lights, but it comes through all the gaps in between because of the rupture. And I like the idea because it helps me to understand. It helps me to embrace the fact that it takes the entire generation for survivors of trauma to be able to love again. But it will never be the same love. It is a different kind of love. And that's why if I could continue during my speech for the World Conference on Faith and Order in Egypt late last year, I put the title of my speech in reference to what the Lord said, do this in remembrance of ruptured me. That's what being in mission for me. That's what healing means for me. It is the rupturing, but at the same time, the rupturing brings new gaps through which new lights come.
You have been doing this for such a long time, and it must take a lot of tenderness, listening, and compassion to do research like this. Does it take a toll on yourself as a researcher and writer?
Indeed. I think I will need to write another book for that, especially when I write things related to trauma. When I was writing my dissertation, I wasn't aware of it. When I interviewed women, a lot of them never had someone came and wanted to listen to their stories. I think I was the first theologian. Before me, there were anthropologists, but I think I was the first theologian who came and just being there, listened to their stories. And I remember even within one particular day, the women gathered in the place where I was staying and asking me to just sit with us and listen to our stories. It took a toll on my body without me realizing what was it. Because they told me about the stories they witnessed. One woman witnessed her husband was killed by her relatives, her Muslim relatives. You know, those kind of horrific stories. And then it took me a while to realize that I suffered vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, because of me listening intentionally compassionately to those stories. It took me a while to realize. So when I was writing that particular chapter of my dissertation, I had to go through therapy to really be able to channel what was on my body. So that also helped me to understand that being a witness has helped me to understand that I was there not only as a researcher. The women whom entrusted their stories to me saw me not as a researcher. They saw me as a minister, and they saw me as a witness. That's why I only ask one question. What story do you want to share? You could imagine I interview about 30 plus women while me staying in their village. One woman would, went on and on for 2 or 3 hours, and all horrific. And it was the first time for them just to have someone being there, just sit with them. So then I learned that's why I needed to study trauma, and I needed to study trauma theology, because I need to know what capacity that I need to build up for myself in order to be able to witness to those stories. And then after that, it took me to stories of survivors of sexual violence, so many other things. Then theology has helped me to find different grammar to understand, and what I call, as Rebecca S. Chop said, it's poetic testimony. It has to go through that, because oftentimes I found I couldn't write, I couldn't say clearly, even in my language, but somehow I found art has been really helpful through poems, through songs that I wrote, but also through dancing. This has become my way of doing theology, beyond just writing, beyond researching and so on. I need to make use things that I know I have, and that's a different door that has been opened for me to work with local communities as well through art.
I know that you have learned classical Indonesian dance and use dance and aesthetic as ways of speaking about trauma and bring about healing and reconciliation. Why did you learn to dance and use dance as a way of healing?
I used to sing. I love singing more than dancing, because as a child, I'm used to watching dance performance from various ethnic groups. But always I had in my mind, why do women and men dance differently? All those kind of things. But I never knew that there are answers to that, using gender analysis later on. But then, because of my own physical limitation, I have scoliosis, and it became worse when I was doing my doctoral study. That's why I had to go also through therapy while doing my doctoral study. There were years of time where I was in class and I had to stand up after 15 minutes just to be able to avoid the pain in my spine. Then I realized I need to do something with that. But even before I did my study, I try to remember now, it was in 2001, not long after the 9/11. When 9/11 took place in New York, I was at the time member of the executive committee of the World Council of Churches. We were having a meeting in Geneva, and we learned about that attack in New York. And then, to make story short, in October, I was part of the WCC conference in Africa, and I was supposed to present a paper when I couldn't move. Something happened with my spine. I was in Africa, and I forgot to carry my medicine. So the WCC committee at the time put me back on the flight. I laid flat from Tanzania to Amsterdam, from Amsterdam to Indonesia. I remember I was on the plane. I was so afraid that I couldn't walk. So what I had in mind, I was dancing. That's what came in my mind. And I remember I asked God, I said, God, can you make me dancing? and I will use that as my ministry. Never then I realized that was the beginning, not only as my artistic and my theological, but also my spiritual journey. And since then, I've seen dancing as part of my theological discourse, my theological practice, but also part of my spiritual journey of healing. So I believe that, and I've been using it since then. But not until I reached the age of 47, then I decided that I want to learn seriously Indonesian classical dance. So I studied pretty late. But I knew my body, and I said, I need to reinvent my body because I'm doing this. I know I have that gift of dancing, meditative dance, but somehow, as an Indonesian woman, I said, it's very rich heritage. So I went and took a course on Balinese dance. It was hard, but I'm so happy that I did it. So then started with that, I combined the traditional Indonesian traditional dance, the much more meditative, because always dancing for me is a form of prayer. But it works, working with local congregations, with my students, with my colleagues here at Jakarta Seminary, but also interfaith settings.
We are very blessed seeing you dancing and also leading dancing in some of the Asian and Asian American women's meeting. Now, tell us something about your current research. I know that you are developing what is called blue theology to address climate change and climate emergency.
I tested the water because I wanted to extend the conversation, not leaving behind the mission studies, trauma theology, and feminist theology, not at all. I like to synthesize things. So I wanted to bring all this together because I believe it's an era of collaboration. It's an era of crossing boundaries, but also like back and forth, but at the same time coming from Indonesia as a maritime country. I published a piece, an article on blue missiology. Really wanted to know, where do I go from here? And then from this current research on blue witnessing, really wanted to develop based on my own stories. For me, it is returning to the roots, the story of my grandmother, who was a Muslim and then became a Christian. Herself was really a symbol of woman who has power and financial power, but also at the same time share about the importance of spiritual world that I never paid attention to before. So me coming back and returning to that setting and try to understand, how do I respond to the fact that climate crisis is embodied within the stories of these maritime societies and communities? And there where I said, I need to go back, not to other stories, but to my own stories. So I'm now in the process. We'll be also visiting fields to be able to talk with a group of indigenous women, especially looking at their rituals of the sea and their stories of the sea, including whether or not the trauma experiences that they experienced of tsunami have changed their understanding and their relationship with the sea. And I'm still in that process and really wanted to not only to extend the conversation, but to bring the conversation, the global conversation also into Indonesia. And through sharing both the personal stories and the collective stories of indigenous women, it's just fascinating to learn from the sea. And for example, I will redevelop the concept of hospitality that I used before, but what I will call liquid hospitality and porous healing. Those kind of really wanted to look at from the body of water and really learn from there. And then it's just fascinating for me because it's like I've known all this before, but this is my time of speaking to it and listening to this different narrative, being sensitive to the blueness of the story of who God is. I hope I will be able to have enough time to push forward the conversation, because eco-theology has given already enough attention to green theology. I'm not dividing green and blue, but I started from blue. And from the perspective of blueness of theology, I will offer those elements of what kind of hospitality I already established, not ready yet, about the concept of house, but it's not settling. It's like waving. It's like the wave of the sea. All those images, learning from the indigenous women in Indonesia. And I know, because I've tested the three concepts, and then the importance of women's bodies, the sea, and rituals. And I've identified the stories of rituals as resistance, healing, and persistence.
I can't wait to read your new research and learn from it.
Thank you for you to be part of this conversation for this project.
Thank you. If you find this episode helpful for you, please click like and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.